Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this report launch about free trade. My name is Johan, and I'm member of the GA Trade Activist Group. And I can hear myself somehow. It's from here. A lot of devices. Yeah, too many devices. Here we go. Yes, so I'll start out by presenting who are we in Global Aktion. And I still have my own sound, which is really annoying. Yeah, so I'll start out, explain who are we in GA and why have we written this report on free trade, which we've called free trade myths. På dansk, myter om frihandel, konsekvenserne af et skævt system. And then Magnus, also from the trade group, will present the main conclusions from the report. And then we've invited Admire Mutizwa, who hopefully is with us on Zoom. Admire is an economist and trade activist from Zimbabwe. And he will talk on why the global trade system is unjust from a global south perspective. And Admire, he has followed quite intensely the negotiations between the European Union and several regional blocs in the global south in the negotiations of free trade agreements called the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements. And therefore, Admire, he has a very special sort of insight into how free trade agreements are made and how what it looks like from a civil society perspective in the global south. We interviewed Admire when we wrote the report. So when you skim through it, there are several of his contributions in it. And then in the end, we'll have a conversation with Admire and us, where you can ask questions about the report or about free trade in general. Yes. So firstly, just a few words on why are we here in Global Aktion and why have we written this report? So if you don't know Global Aktion, we call ourselves a solidarity movement. And that means that we work together with partners in the global south to fight global inequality. We have projects in Mozambique, in Western Sahara, in South Africa, in Mauritius, and several other places. But in the trade activist group, where we are from and was written this report, we also try to change some of those economic structure is part of upholding. Interesting. And so throughout the years, we have done a lot of advocacy work. We have written several reports. This one from 2018, which is a very thin version of the one we've written now. And then 2 years ago, we wrote this one called Benzin på bålet, in English, gasoline on the fire, about a free trade agreement between EU and the Mercosur bloc for South American countries, where we highlighted how this trade agreement would liberalize trade with soy and thereby worsen deforestation in the Amazon. And when we wrote this report, it's quite short and it didn't require that much work, but it actually got a quite good response because this wasn't a subject that had been widely debated in Denmark. So after we had published it, several other civil society organizations made a coalition together with us to try to stop this agreement from passing in the Danish parliament. And it also got a bit of media attention. So we saw that as quite of a success. And therefore, we thought that now was the time to sort of write this more comprehensive and longer report that sort of summarize the many different ways that the current global trade system is disadvantageous for the global south and recreates inequality. This report is also kind of written to that friend we all have who are engaged in trade, that always say that when you're critical towards free trade, he will tell you one of two things. Either he will tell you, but don't you know that free trade has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty? That's one reaction that you will very often meet. Or otherwise, he will say, oh, you're critical towards free trade, so are you a Trumpist? And you'll be like, no. So this report is kind of written to that friend. In the sense that it tries to debunk a quite strong narrative about free trade that is widely shared both among politicians from a broad left to right spectrum of political parties, and that is also widely shared among students, and even though those NGOs and civil society organizations that work on global development. So even though that globalization has been more discussed in the recent years with Trump and with Brexit, you still find this narrative that free trade benefits all. Free trade creates a win-win situation both for the producers in the global south and the consumers in the global north. And this is the narrative that we try to counter by writing this report. If you hear the current, or that's now the former, Danish foreign minister, Jeppe Kofod, also the last foreign minister before him, Anders Samuelsen, they all praise free trade. And free trade is inscribed in the Danish developmental strategy, Dansk Strategi for Udviklingshjælp, where it says that free trade is essential for strengthening the economies of the global south. So we try to argue that this narrative is fundamentally wrong. We have raised 6 myths, which Magnus in a second will make some highlights from. And generally, we argue that the way the global trade system is arranged is a way that benefit large multinational corporations at the expense of workers and the environment in the global south. Yes, I think I won't say much more, and then I'll give the word to you.
Yes, sounds great. Well, hi, my name is Magnus Nielsen, and I'm also an activist in the trade policy activist group in GA. I think that's all the introduction you need, actually. Just trying to figure out how to do this correctly. There we go. All right, so to present the main points of our report, which are critical arguments about free trade, we first need to get like a really broad overall sketch of what free trade even means. And you can consider free trade as like a coin with 2 sides. It's the idea side and it's the practice, the institutionalization side. So if we start with the idea of free trade that lies behind the manifestation in the real world of free trade policies, what we can say is that free trade builds on the argument and the theory of comparative advantages. This is a theory that argues that it's a theory about international trade, and it argues that if each country in the world specializes their production in the sector or in the sectors and economic activities in which they have a so-called comparative advantage, that would be sectors where they can either produce the stuffs they make more cheaply than others, or not even more cheaply, but because perhaps they are the worst at producing everything, but they will be relatively less worse at producing that stuff relatively to how expensive they will make other stuff. That's a bit tricky, but the idea is if every country specializes in the sectors where they have a comparative advantages, and then instead of making everything themselves, only make that stuff and sell that on the international market, and then import all the other stuff they need, then what the result will be a positive sum game, so a win-win. So there will not be like one country winning in this deal and another country getting really poor from it. Instead, both of the countries, and they may be poor and they may be rich to begin with, they will end up winning. So they will end up obtaining more prosperity, economic growth, and cheaper goods for their consumers. And this will also spur a lot of very constructive competition on the world market, which means that that the investments and the production will go to the countries where things are produced most cheaply, and that will benefit all the consumers because then they will get more cheap goods. But to have this theory about making only a few things and then importing a lot of stuff, it can only work if trade is free, hence the name free trade. And what does that mean? And this is really the key in the theory, because without this, it doesn't work. Because if there are a lot of barriers to trade, then you can't make this arrangement. Making trade free is basically about removing barriers to trade. And what are those? Through history, traditionally, the primary barrier to trade has been tariffs. So tariffs is this kind of import tax that you put up at the border when you import goods to make them more expensive, meaning that stuff coming from abroad is more expensive than the stuff you make at home. Okay, so free trade would be about removing the barrier, being tariffs. Today, it's not only tariffs, and it's because this theory and this political project has been expanded. So it's also about removing what is conceived as other kinds of barriers, so-called non-tariff barriers to trade, or beyond the border. So even after the product has entered the country, the argument goes that there may be some other kind of barriers making the trade with this product unfree or standing in the way. That could be regulation, different kinds of regulation, and in particular strict kind of regulations, being environmental or other kind. It could be different kind of product standards or patents, or no, not patents, sorry, but other kind of regulations, or what the World Bank would probably call a unfavorable business climate, meaning a business climate where it's really hard to be a foreign direct investor coming into the country and trying to trade and invest. Okay, so it's still the same idea, remove the barriers, but we have expanded the ideas, the notion of barriers from tariffs to tariffs and other kinds of barriers. This is the general argument, and it is used also when we talk about, for example, the EU is a free trade zone in itself, so trade between Denmark and Germany is also under this umbrella. But particularly when we look at trade between what we call the global north and the global south, or the former colonizing or colonized countries, or rich and poor countries, however you want to frame it, there is another layer to this, because the argument is the same. Free trade is a win-win game for everyone. But when it comes to free trade between the global north and the global south, this win-win positive sum game is the perfect development model, so-called modernization. This is not only good for everyone, it's particularly good for the poor countries, because it will lift the poor countries. It will make them climb the same ladder of development as the rich country have done, and they will end up being as economically well off as we are. Okay, so same argument, but with an extra development layer. And this is the hegemonic narrative, and I can't stress that enough, that this is really hegemonic. So we have a lot of political discussions, and in neoliberalism, for example, we talk a lot about, race to the bottom on taxes, and we have moved to a more neoliberal tax policy. We have, but on the tax issue, I think you could still argue that there are like two quite strong camps arguing for and against high taxes, at least in Denmark. when it comes to free trade discourse and narrative, I think the hegemony or the dominance of the discourse is much stronger, and that's what Johan was pointing to, the fact that we go all the way from the right to, yeah, a huge part of the left as well supporting this political project. Okay, that's the idea side of the coin. And how does this play out in practice? And this is going to be like a really rough sketch, of course. So the way we approach it is being situated in the political context of Denmark is, of course, looking at it from a Danish perspective. And Denmark does not make their own trade agreements. We have given that competence to the EU as a member state. So when you talk about Danish trade policy, you should really speak about EU trade policy. And if we look at EU trade policy, there are two main chunks of the institutionalization of the trade policy. One being that the EU and all the member states, including Denmark, take part in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is an international organization consisting of the majority of all the countries in the world, in which there are some foundational treaties and some agreements, the rules of the WTO, that lay out the free trade policy. So in other words, the rules of the WTO are about removing these barriers, tariffs and regulations. The other chunk are the bilateral agreements. And they come, you can say, on top of the WTO. So the bilateral agreements of the EU are agreements between the EU and another country or another group of countries. Johan named Mercosur, or we talked about the EPAS. We can have, there's a free trade agreement between Denmark and Japan, or one with Canada. And the gist of these agreements are basically the same as the World Trade Organization rules. So it's about free trade and removing barriers. What you can say, and the reason they come on top, is because the rules tend to go even further. So it's an amplification of the same political project. So removing even more tariffs and deregulating even more and so on. Okay. Last part of the manifestation side of the coin is the particular view to the global south. And that's, of course, a huge part of the world. So what I would like to do also, due to Admire being our guest or our speaker today, is looking at the African continent. And what if you zoom in on the EU trade relation with the African continent, on top of the World Trade Organization rules, again, the EU for the last 20 years has pursued negotiating and making these EPAS, economic partnership agreements, which are, in the case of Africa, 5 different regional trade agreements with 5 different groups of African countries. And EU has been trying to finalize these agreements for 20 years with mixed success. So some of them are in place, some of them are partly in place, and some of them aren't, because they've not been as welcomed and as easy to finalize for the EU as the EU were hoping 20 years ago. But I want to go more to this. This is just to give you like an overall sketch of this dominant policy project and idea of free trade. What I want to delve into is our arguments. But before I do that, I just want to flag like some sort of a meta comment on our arguments and our criticisms. And it concerns the question of the notions of rich and poor countries, as opposed to the notions of different classes, so class societies. Because when trade agreements are made between countries, and when we speak of the global north and the global south, and how there are these different ways of the global south being harmed by the current trade policy, which I will delve into, one might say that there is this latent idea of the countries of the global south, or a particular African country, being this homogeneous unity. So, if it's bad for Mozambique, it's equally bad for everyone in Mozambique. And I don't think we would argue this in our group, because we also subscribe to a class analytical view of society, meaning that both the countries of the global north, Denmark and so on, and also Mozambique and so on, are class society, so internally divided societies. And this makes it a bit more tricky to speak about how the trade policies between the EU and, for example, Mozambique is harming Mozambique. And I think the way we position ourselves in this dilemma is to say that if we made much more favorable terms of trade for the countries of the global south, so if we got rid of all the bad things in free trade, which we will come back to, this wouldn't suffice, this wouldn't be enough for all the countries of the global south to prosper, because they would still be class societies. So you might see local elites, also because of the globalization of the capitalist class, you might see local elites gaining from this without the broader population of these countries gaining. On the other hand, even though this is not sufficient to have more favorable terms of trade, you can nevertheless still say that bad terms of trade, which in my opinion is free trade policies, shrinkens and harms any room for economic progress and sovereign determination of the economic development in the country. So this doesn't annul any class struggle, but it still makes class struggle even harder if your country in general is just being made very, very poor due to the international trade. Okay, that's just a meta comment. So as Johan said, we have structured the main chunk of the report around different kind of myths, which would be like critical arguments why free trade isn't as wonderful as they all say. I won't go into all of them, but one aspect of one of them is concerns when we speak about comparative advantages, which was this key element to the whole free trade project. What we argue is that it also makes sense to speak about comparative disadvantages. And what does that mean? Well, a comparative advantage was something that a country could, as particular product or economic activity that one country could perform very cheaply, cheaper than other countries. That's a comparative advantage. But why can some countries in the global south produce something very cheaply? What kind of comparative advantage do they have? Well, very loose and bad environmental regulation. It's oftentimes a comparative advantage because then you can produce very cheaply. Low wages, horrible working conditions, long working hours are also a comparative advantage. There's a reason all our clothing aren't made in Copenhagen, but in other parts of the world. And this is an important reason for that. Again, that's you might say Indonesia have a comparative advantage in making my jeans, but that does not make it advantageous for the workers making the jeans to have such bad working conditions. You could also look at tax evasion and tax havens as having a comparative advantage in tax. This picture is from Bangladesh, where we have seen Bangladesh having a comparative advantage in shipbreaking because they can do very little regulation or wages is to get even lower wages and even lower regulations. And this, given the fact that we have economic globalization, so capital is mobile, the transnational corporations can shop around, they're not bound to one country. This can play the country against each other. And what we see is a race to the bottom. And I would argue the last 40 years, that's what we've been seeing, a race to the bottom in terms of tax, in terms of a lot of what we, under the umbrella of neoliberalism. It oftentimes comes back at least partly to this. Okay, that's the first critical concern. And the next one is another aspect of the same view on comparative disadvantages, and it concerns what we see when we zoom in on not only the theoretical argument, but the particular sectors and economic activities in which countries of the global south have an economic comparative advantage and in which they focus their economies. And what we see is that it's often, beside the low-wage labor sectors that I talked about, it's often in commodities, so primary goods, natural resources. So it's often cocoa beans and coffee beans, not coffee shops. I was about to say that's something else. Ready-made chocolate, and because that's where they right now have the comparative advantage, and they should just trade in that instead of trying to protect their economy and develop it in another direction. And these kind of economic activities, primary goods, natural resources, are very low value activities. So they are activities with low wages and low tax benefits for the state, and a very little part of the chocolate that you buy in the shop goes to the country with the chocolate, the cocoa beans, and a lot of it goes to, I don't know, say France, where Nestle is manufacturing the chocolate. So this is another aspect. When we look at the particular sectors, what we see is it's not that likely that we will see that much economic progress in these countries, because they should focus on what they already have an advantage in, and that's low value activities. Okay, another critical perspective on the free trade project is concerned with how free trade is a narrative about free competition on a level playing field. So we should remove all the barriers, and free competition, investment goes to where it should, and it's a level playing field. So it's free for all to participate. And therefore, you should just participate with the sectors you're good at, instead of trying to guard yourself and develop your economy in another direction. Well, that's the argument you hear from the EU and from the Danish foreign ministers and so on. But if we look historically, for example, that's not even what the rich countries did themselves. And it's also not that likely that that will work. It comes back to what's called the infant industries argument. And the argument is that even without all the other criticisms of free trade, okay, there might be some economic growth advantages for free trade between Denmark and Canada. Fair enough, that's another discussion. But when you have free trade between countries with very economically developed industries and so-called infants, so industries that haven't taken off, so African car industry as opposed to French and German car industries, what you will see is that you will see a total being out competition from the strong industries against the less strong industries. And that won't spur economic growth and economic development in the country with the infant industry. That would just mean that they'll end up importing a lot of Volkswagen. And of course, they can do that if they're then specialized in cocoa beans, but there are the other arguments why that's not a sustainable strategy. So the free competition is not so free, but it's also not on a level playing field. When we look at the EU as being really the main villain in this game globally, and look at agricultural subsidies. The EU has what we call the Common Agricultural Policy, which takes up a huge chunk of the EU budget. And it's a subsidy to European farmers for them to be able to sell their goods more cheaply. That's the result, at least, because they get the money from the EU. And what they then can go and do is to dump their now more cheap agricultural goods on foreign markets, for example, the African markets, which mean that they can outcompete the local farmers, not because even they're more competitive, but that's not even that, but because they've had this helping hand. And you don't have an equal amount of subsidies on the African continent, so that's not a level playing field. Okay, a third perspective, and this comes perhaps a bit more directly back to the issue of class societies being engaged in trade policies. And it concerns how, when we speak about free trade, it's you may very narrowly say it leads to more GDP growth or economic growth. There are some arguments for how it's bad for economic development in global south, but all things being equal, of course, sometimes it will lead to more economic activities. So you will buy and sell more goods because there are less barriers. Fair enough. If we forget all about all other concerns with democracy and environmental regulation and all that other stuff, you might see economic growth coming from some free trade arrangements. But the problem is that when the country, again, when we see Mozambique having a GDP rise due to more engagement in economic globalization. It's not the same as people of Mozambique experiencing improvements of their lives. And the reason for that is, of course, we see a lack of redistribution. So that's the idea. So if you've lost your job in a country in the global south because you're no longer competitive in that particular sector, that's all right, because you can change your job as long as you're being compensated and redistributed to until you've gotten your new job. And that's not the political reality. Instead, what we see, the people who are withdrawing the money from this growth that we might see are typically the large transnational corporations. This is statistically rather strongly supported. So in the end, and this also goes back to the fact that the transnational corporations can shop around, so they can also get more beneficial tax arrangements. But in the end, the basic argument is that if you say that free trade leads to more economic growth, you should ask growth for whom? And we tend to forget that. So again, a rather basic point when you put it up on a PowerPoint, at least. The fourth and last myth or critical perspective on free trade that I will highlight now, it's not all of them, but is how it's perhaps a bit more tricky to frame, but what we see is that free trade, because it's so dominant, everybody agrees that it's a wonderful idea, and it's just about get rid of the barriers. I mean, who can disagree? So what we see is a depoliticization of free trade. So free trade is not about politics and conflicts of interests. It's about having smart trade agreements, smart trade policies. And what that tends to obscure is the fact that trade policies are indeed a question of power, not only due to the other slides, but in particular also because when the free trade project has expanded from only removal of tariffs to removal of other kind of barriers to trade, what is beneath the carpet in that very broad umbrella saying other barriers to trade is a lot of really crazy, no, really crucial, no, not crucial, but there's a lot of different kind of political tools that have a huge impact on society and which directly transfers power from the broader populations of the countries to these transnational corporations. And it just says, okay, we should get rid of other barriers to trade, other regulations. But if you actually look at what that means, what we see is, first of all, trade agreements are one of the main ways to institutionalizing these parallel courts, ISDS, that some of you might have heard of, which are a parallel justice system in which transnational corporations can sue states if states have made policies that shrinken their future profits, not the profits they're making now, but the future profits. This is not a right everybody gets, but it's a parallel court system for transnational corporations. This is not smart or unsmart policies. This is not a neutral question. You can be for it, but it's definitely a question of power and conflicting interests. And this is obscured in the way we speak about trade policy. Another argument of another aspect of how free trade transfers power to the private multinational corporations is, for example, the rules about services, public procurement, financial services, which are all these very, very thick and big service rule chapters of the free trade agreement that lays out how they should liberalize, how you should not discriminate foreign banks, for example, when it comes to the financial service chapter. And again, what we see is that it's the same marketization, liberalization as what we all think of when somebody says neoliberalism. It's actually in these agreements, also in other places, but very much in these trade agreements that the actual policies of marketization, privatization, liberalization is embedded. So it's not about smart policies, it's about the question of power that is neoliberalism. Fair enough if you're pro, but it's still political. A third example would be patents that have been extended quite vastly the last 30 years with the free trade regime. The last horrible example of that would be the lack of access to vaccines in COVID in the global south due to the very, very, very strong patent protection for these very rich multilateral big pharma companies who made their vaccines due to public money. That's another discussion. But again, you see, this is a tool of power for the big pharma corporations. Again, you can argue it's smart and it's a longer discussion, but it's definitely not useful. We can also, as a longer discussion about how capital mobility, so the ability to restrict transfers of capital, of money in and out of the country, is also restricted quite severely in these agreements. And again, I would argue, it strengthens the political position of the financial sectors and the speculators, and it weakens the position of the local government because you see both sometimes overheating of the economy, which is quite harmful, and capital flight, which is even more harmful because we have this speculative boom and bust international capital flows, and you're not allowed to decide yourself whether you want to regulate that. And I think that points to the more general point that, and maybe, yeah, it's relevant for the last one. So other ways, how should we do with this? First of all, the argument shouldn't be that I have all the perfect policies to solve all this, because it's a lot of stuff. But I think a main principle that's really crucial is that the country should at least be allowed the developmental space to decide themselves whether they want to deregulate, whether they want to do these to institutionalize these free trade policies. So you should, it's fair enough you want to lower your tariff, but it shouldn't be not allowed to make it higher or to restrict capital mobility or to do something like that. So that's a more overall principle that questions how we do free trade right now. In the report, we haven't spent that much energy because then it would have taken even more time and be even thicker on the alternative, but also, and that's a better excuse, because we have done it in other reports. 3 years ago, we published these two, particularly the boring white one, which is the biggest and most substantial one of them, that goes through economic sector by sector recommendations for how an alternative trade policy could look. And we haven't changed our minds completely since that, so I think it's a nice prequel or sequel to this one. But then again, I just think that the more meta point about other ways of doing trade policy is just allowing countries to go in both directions. You can liberalize, but you should also be allowed to deliberalize, re-municipalize, re-regulate, and so on. And that's really hard right now. Yes, I think those are my main takeaways from the report.
Yes, let's give Magnus a hand. I'll suggest we just take 10 minutes break so we can make sure that the technique with the Admire works. So let's start again, 25. Let's give Admire a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Can you confirm if you can hear me?
We can hear you perfectly.
Thank you very much, and congratulations for the launch of this important resource. As you have introduced me, my name is Admire Mutizwa. I work with the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, leading the program on church and justice. I've worked on the global trade system for quite some time, and as I'm speaking currently, I'm in Berlin, in Germany, where we have been discussing issues related to the issues that you are unpacking in the report you are launching today. So my presentation, I will just touch a bit on the neoliberal framework and the free trade agenda. I will speak a little bit on why the global trade system is problematic, but I think I will try to focus much on the economic partnership agreements between the European Union and the ACP countries. Of course, I didn't want to conclude for the obvious reasons that the platform here has to make some conclusions on the basis of the issues that are being put on the table. So let's start a little bit on the issue of the neoliberal framework upon which the free trade agenda is set. So many of you might be aware that neoliberalism or the neoliberal framework is anchored on issues of privatization, where the government has to have less control of the economy, that's having the private sector as the key actor in the economy. But we've seen that privatization does not always work. It has its own pitfalls and shortfalls and gaps. The second principle that neoliberalism, as it is connected to the free market agenda, is anchored on is the principle of efficiency, where we always, the assumption is that having the private sector play a key role, it improves efficiency of markets, but also opening up economies. It also helps to improve both the different forms of efficiency, including distributive efficiency, among others. And within this framework, you will see that we have had the arguments that let's limit the role of the government, let's reduce regulation, and let's reduce public ownership of the key sectors of the economy. And it is within the same framework that the push for austerities, deregulation, is also spearheaded. So the basic principles of neoliberalism, as it is connected to free trade, the aspect of free enterprise, aspect of competition, the aspect of deregulation, underpins this whole neoliberal framework. And it is upon the neoliberalism that the argument that let's open our economies to external competition is premised, and state power is reduced. But what we have realized over the years, now coming to the issue of trade, is that countries that have opened up to trade, they have gone through different stages. Many countries didn't start by opening up, by reducing tariffs, and by being transparent with their public procurement processes. But we have seen that they have undertaken deliberate, systematic industrialization strategies, and it's when the industries are mature enough to compete, that's when we see markets being opened. But there is also the other catch that other countries have pursued trade on the basis of looking for resources. So while this trade is pushed on the basis that it improves welfare as a result of the efficient allocation of resources, thereby reducing poverty, inequality, food security, and unemployment, among many other things. We have seen that industrialization and growth has not been happening in developing countries, despite them opening up to trade. And foreign direct investment has not increased at the pace expected and at the pace that the same countries have been opening up to global trade. The idea of economic convergence, we are far away from it. Whilst there is growing international trade, the disparities and inequalities between countries has also been growing. So we have seen trade deepening, countries becoming more integrated to the global economy, but at the same time, we have seen growth in poverty, in casualization of labor, in unemployment, in inequalities. We have seen growth in food insecurities, among many, many other challenges at the same time. So the aspirations that are pursued under an open global trading system, they have not largely been realized, especially by the developing countries. And this is the reason why generally the global trade system that is largely underpinned by an open and free market paradigm has not been largely welcomed by quite a significant number of development economists who focuses on the need to have some kind of balance when we pursue industrialization and development. So here I just try to highlight why there is the push for an open trading system. But I also want to make the argument that we have not realized largely some of the issues that have been said to be the benefits of opening up. So trade and international trade, which is open and free trade, is regarded as a tool to achieve all these good things. But on the other hand, we have not really realized this as there is always growing disparity between developed and developing countries. And for some of you who might be aware of developments within the World Trade Organization, this is the reason why some of the aspects, the issues that were supposed to have been finalized in terms of negotiating issues to do with public procurement, issues to do with trade in services, issues to do with the digital economy, e-commerce, and so forth. Those negotiations, as told, they have not been progressing for quite some time. And the critical reason is that many developing countries felt that continuing opening those issues, those sectors, it was going to significantly expose the developing countries to the vulnerabilities of the global economy, and thereby leading to the collapse of economies in the developing world. So why is this system not really good? Or what are the challenges within this system? We have got unequal power relations. That's the starting point. Unequal power relations, the monopoly of the rules with those who have got the global economic power the negotiations are not as open and as equal as you would want them to be. So it's largely those who do have the economic power that determines the final and outright agreements. And giving the example I mentioned, why we have seen stalled negotiations within the World Trade Organization, it's only when developed countries had come together on certain key issues that they thought they could not negotiate further. That's when they managed to gather enough and sufficient power to resist unequal trade relations. And at this note, let me highlight that this is what then resulted in the genesis of bilateral trade relations or bilateral trade agreements, including the economic partnership agreements. As I will touch on EPAs, you realize one of the arguments is that EPAs, they contain issues, some of the issues that were rejected within the negotiations in the World Trade Organization. But I will park that for now and touch on a few more issues why the global system is not really good. We have the presence of monopolies, big corporations that have got massive power, and these cannot operate in an environment that is substantially open. Developing countries need to put some measures to ensure that the presence of these multinational companies in their local spaces contribute to industrialization, diversification, and growth. But the kind of the framework that has been pushed in terms of the global trade system so far, you see that most of the global monopolies have been contributing to the natural resource dependence of developing countries without contributing to industrialization, without contributing to diversification, without contributing to skills transfers, among many other issues. So the presence of monopolies that are unregulated, that are quite operating in a liberalized framework has not been helpful. And more importantly, the rights of workers and the rights of the nations that they are operating in, they become so much trampled. But let me also highlight that we have had the problem of the finance architecture globally. The way the financial system within the global markets operate has not been conducive to promote a trade that benefits developing countries. So operating in the context of monopolized global financial system, where the global powers, they have the power to control the monopoly, to control the financial markets, it has not done good to the developing countries for them to be able then to open up their markets on the basis of a fair financial system that also promotes their local industries. A number of issues, but I think the power dynamics, the global power interests determine what to trade, and they skews the trade system. I think this is the fundamental reason why free and open trade, as it is advocated as a tool to poverty reduction, to inequality, to growth, to prosperity, to improve the welfare, has not really delivered. We have seen that developing countries have remained producers of commodities, whilst developed countries have become the producers and the distributors of the manufactured and finished products, and being the key players when it comes to the financial systems, when it comes to many other services that are also traded. Now, let me come to the economic partnership agreement. What are economic partnership agreements? These are agreements which were negotiated between the European Union and the ACP countries. And the economic partnership agreements, they came as a result of a number of issues. One was that before the EPAs, the EU and ACP countries had agreed what was called a preferential trading system, where the ACP countries, they had some preferential trade, so they could send goods, or they could export goods to the European market on preferential terms. But this was then challenged by other countries within the World Trade Organization to say it violates certain rules of the World Trade Organization, especially the rule of reciprocal trade, but also aspects that include the most favored nation principle. So what then happened is that the EU, in the context of the Cotonou Agreement, invited ACP countries to then negotiate a new trade system that was going to be compatible with the WTO rules. And it is at this moment that it also coincided with the time when the WTO was not making progress on negotiations to do with agriculture, to do with public procurement, to do with investment liberalization, to do with digital trade, to deal with e-commerce, among many other things. So you then realize that the European Union then also took advantage to bring negotiations that were stalled within the World Trade Organization to the economic partnership agreements. And here, this is one of the criticism around economic partnership agreements, that whilst they were supposed to focus on issues that were of contention within the World Trade Organization, they then brought issues that are over and above those issues which were at contention, and they tried to negotiate in a bilateral way with the weaker ACP parties. But what do the economic partnership agreements offer? These are reciprocal trade agreements. And what they mean is that the ACP countries, African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, they offer the same conditions of trade as the European Union. So the EPAs are duty-free and quota-free agreement, where the ACP countries can now export goods and services to the European Union without any quotas and without any duty. But the same offer by the European Union has to be offered by the African Caribbean. And this is where the challenge is, because the ACP countries, they are at different stages of development with the European Union, and they cannot offer the same level of access to European Union products as the EU. So you see that at the negotiations, a lot of things had to happen, a lot of negotiations. Some countries within the ACP, they had to offer 80% of their market, and they had to secure 20% of their economy, of their products. And this was a way of now trying to reduce the threats that come with the exports from the European Union into the ACP countries. So the EPAs were promoted as tools towards sustainable development for the ACP countries, as tools towards poverty reduction, as tools towards supporting regional integration processes in Africa. They were promoted as a means of achieving gradual integration of African countries into the global market. And more importantly, African countries were saying they were going to have ability to leverage trade for economic growth. But when the negotiations started around the years 2000, they were met with fierce resistance. And what were the bases of this resistance? The first is that the negotiations fragmented the African continent in particular, but also the ACP group. In Africa alone, the negotiations ended up taking 8 different formations. And those, by forming different negotiating blocks, it then weakened the powers of different African countries. And that also then reduces the capacity, the power, and the ability to negotiate better agreements. But by also fragmenting, forming different formations, it also was an indirect attack to one of the objectives of these agreements, which was to promote regional integration. So you cannot promote regional integration by fragmenting the same countries that you want to integrate, forming a different group. So I can give an example where we have got Zimbabwe, which trade 60% of its products with South Africa. But Zimbabwe and South Africa found themselves in different configurations of the economic partnership agreements, where Zimbabwe is negotiating under the Eastern and Southern African group with the likes of Mauritius, Madagascar, Seychelles, and Comoros. And South Africa is negotiating in another configuration, which is the SADC Economic Partnership Agreement. So Zimbabwe and South Africa, they are neighbors, they trade together, but they were fragmented by the Economic Partnership Agreement negotiations. This is one aspect of how the EPAs were problematic. The second is that the policy space for development was limited. For example, export tariffs. Export tariffs have been used as a tool for industrialization by many developed countries today. What is an export tariff as a policy tool? An export tariff is a tariff that is given to, that is imposed on exports of certain products that could have been beneficiated locally. So companies and industries are charged to export products that can be value added and that can contribute to the industrialization agenda of a country. This is a policy tool that has been used by many developed countries today. But many developing countries within the framework of the EPAs, they cannot then adopt export tariff as a policy towards industrialization. But there are other issues. I mentioned that EPAs brought broad issues than issues that they were supposed to focus on. And I mentioned issues to do with agriculture, negotiations in trade and services, among many other things. So the issue here is the EPAs were supposed to focus on offering rules of trade that are compatible with the WTO. But then the EPAs, the focus went beyond that to include issues that were being disputed within the WTO development agenda focused negotiation. Many other issues, for example, the aspect of infant industry. Now, under the EPAs, the ACP countries were now supposed to open up to 90% of their economy to the EU. This has been regarded as too big for many countries. A number of countries have rejected this, and the economic partnership agreements themselves, they are largely stalled. A few countries have managed to negotiate, but those who were successful, they only negotiated what we call an interim economic partnership agreement, where they agreed to trade only in goods, and most of the other issues that were brought were at a dispute and could not progress. So many countries that were negotiating EPAs, they also had a large sector of their economy as informal economy. And the question was, how is the EPA going to respond to the issues of the informal economy that are 40 to 60% of the economies that are in ACP countries? So these are some of the issues that were at contention, and as a result, we have seen countries not being largely against the ACP countries, though some were put under pressure because they didn't have a policy space to continue exporting to the European Union without the EPAs, and they were forced into some kind of agreements. So some would ask, if the economic partnership agreements are bad, why should the ACP countries accept or go ahead to sign? There are a number of issues. One is that they're in a weak trade position, and at times you are forced into these agreements. There are political reasons. There is at times aid which is attached to the agreement, and the general cooperation and economic relations at times forces some of these countries into negotiations. But the real truth will be the agreement are not an equal power relation agreement. Hence, we continue to see the other parties being dependent on raw commodities and not diversifying or industrializing. So, how do I conclude? I think we still need a rule-based trade system that recognizes the interest of developing countries and that takes a gradual developmental approach to opening up to trade for purposes of industrialization and diversification. The interests of the weaker parties need to be respected. The interests of the weaker parties need to be put at the center of negotiations. And developed countries should consider that themselves, they adopted quite a number of tools that are currently not allowed within the global for them to develop and for be taken on that basis. I end here, and we can interact. Thank you very much. Back to you, facilitator.
Thank you very much, Admire, for a super interesting and very thorough introduction to the EPAS. I hope that you got some of the main points about how the essence of why the EPAS are problematic is that they try to create this level playing field where African companies can sell their products to the EU and we can sell our products to the African countries on an equal footing, but which is essentially unjust because it's not a level playing field. And also some of the points that Admire raised in the end about, so why do African countries sign these agreements if they are so bad for them? There are different answers. Admire gave some very important points on EU can threaten by withholding foreign aid. They can use aid as a tool for making these unjust trade agreements. He also mentioned how they can pressure by denying African countries market access. So saying, if you don't sign this agreement, we won't give you access to our markets. So thank you for some very good points, Admire. We only have 5 minutes left. So I'll give the audience the chance to ask questions. We'll just take a few, and then if you have any more, you can come up to us afterwards. So you're welcome to ask questions either to us or to Admire. Yes, in the back.
How come that we consider selling goods from farming goods with tilskud? How come that is considered free trade? I don't understand that.
Yes.
And what about you mentioned, or no, not you, but Magnus, I think his name, mentioned the what's it called, patenter, the patents. Why are they considered also part of free trade?
Yeah. Do you want us to answer? Oh, okay. So, Admire, the first question was, why do we consider agricultural subsidies to be free trade? I can just very shortly answer, that's also absurd. It isn't. And that's actually one of the few points where you can find neoliberals agreeing with us that agricultural subsidies is completely unfair. The second question was about patents, and what was it again?
Just why is that considered free trade also part of free trade?
Because the argument for having patents is that as a company, when you invent something, you have to be sure that you get secure the profits, right?
But I'm just wondering why it's part of free trade.
Yeah. No, it's a good question.
It's a part of the World Trade Organization. It's negotiated there.
And maybe it isn't a part of free trade, but it's more just a part of some vested interests that big corporations that pressure for these patent rights in free trade agreements and in the WTO. Yes, we have another question.
Yes, thank you. A question for Admire, if you are still with us.
Admire, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I'll repeat the question when it has been raised. Yeah.
Admire, your presentation was very much focused on the relation, I believe, between African countries and the EU, and I couldn't help but wonder, to my knowledge at least, we have another actor, China, which over the past, especially 15 years, has increased its presence quite significantly in Africa, and I'm just wondering, from your point of view, if the increased Chinese presence and trade with African countries must be considered a positive development.
Okay, so Admire, the question is on China and the increased Chinese trade with African countries. What is your perspective on this? Do you consider it to be beneficial for African countries, and what are the controversies?
The beam.
Should I respond?
Yeah, the question was for you. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. I will start with the Chinese presence in Africa. Is it beneficial? I I think it has had some significant negative impacts on many African economic sectors. And unfortunately, the relations are not largely based on concrete agreements. They are largely political in many countries than they are economic, and it has been a real complex problem to deal with. Then the issue of agricultural subsidies. Why are they a trade issue? I think it was said in the meeting that when you subsidize agriculture, especially within the European Union, you are already subsidizing agriculture for players in the agricultural sector who are big and who are well established, who are well mechanized and so forth. And these subsidized farmers, they are then supposed to compete with communal farmers in a developing country. So subsidies have really pushed down international prices, and the same commodity that is produced by a well-subsidized. In fact, European farmers under the Common Market for Agriculture policy, they were being comprehensively subsidized. And that farmer will now need to compete in an open market system with a farmer from a developing country who is not comprehensively subsidized. So that becomes an equal trading system. You can't expose those two farmers to the same conditions of the market. So this is why agriculture negotiations failed within the WTO, because developing countries resisted and they asked the European Union and other developed countries to significantly reduce subsidies to their agriculture sector for them to be able to take certain concession on agricultural negotiations. So subsidies, it's a policy, and you will see that in free trade agreements, certain policies have to be done away with. And this is where it becomes a contention if a policy that is beneficial to an economy has to be removed. It creates disagreements, and as a result, you may not agree on some of these issues. I think those are the two issues I picked. Back to you.
Yeah. So do we have one last question for Admire? Because if you have questions for us, you can just come up afterwards. No? Then let's just give Admire a final round of applause. Morten, can you just turn the Admire? You'll just have a chance to see the audience as well. So thank you very much, Admire, and thank all of you for coming. Please grab the report on your way out if you haven't done it already. You can also take one for your friend, your free trade friend who says that it benefits all, and give it to him. And otherwise, just come up and ask us questions if you like.